What is up, ladies and gentlemen? It has been quite a while since I made a video on YouTube. I actually had a shift of focus on things. I had a couple of things going on in my life as well. So, apart from that, this is something that I worked on in the month of June, between June, July, I guess. And I wrote this article around that same time only, and I wanted to talk about this very same article. The reason why I want to talk about this in a way in a specific dedicated video is I feel that the article or the blog itself is not doing enough justice to what I wanted to shed light on. Because sure, not a lot of people um, not a lot of people are fond of reading blogs in the first place. A lot of people like videos and so on and so forth. Apart from that, if I am going to make a video, I can go in a little bit more depth, which I feel that I definitely have covered everything within the blog itself. But I feel that I can definitely uh, cover a couple of more things and maybe be a bit more descriptive and be a bit more elaborate with things in the video, because now I have the liberty to actually see this thing in action, or see this thing in progress, work in front of us. um I'm just gonna start straight off. Let's not waste any time. It's good to see you all again. Happy New Year in advance and a Merry Christmas, right? This article revolves around state management, right? State management in SDLC, and this video or this blog or article is gonna come in very handy. It's gonna be very nice if you work with JavaScript or TypeScript, or if you work with Flutter, or maybe even React Native. Not exactly for Flutter, because the folks who are using Dart to develop apps, or maybe even React Native as well, I believe, you guys have a very well defined architecture of developing apps. You have the MVC, MVP, and MVVM stuff. But on the desktop side of things, or the general SDLC side of things, we don't really have that. Or majorly the most important software development that is happening a lot these days are essentially web apps, right? And there are plenty of JavaScript and TypeScript developers as well, so this will come in handy to them. But apart from that, this is language, platform, and environment agnostic. This is not dependent on that. The only key requirement for this particular architecture or the strategy to work is that you have type safety. Otherwise, you'll have to makes you bring in pseudo type safety into your project, which you'll realize by the end of this discussion. This is more of a discussion, not a tutorial. I'm not trying to teach you something, but I'm trying to have a discussion so that I can have your views on things and matters as well. So this will be a learning journey for both the parties here. Anyhow, we will be talking a lot about states, and I believe that you folks understand what a state is, right? I'm not going to delve into what that is. If you are still unsure, then you shouldn't be watching this video, right? And just for the sake of this video, I will be using Pinia. It is exactly like Redux, just a little bit more toned down, and it is available for Vue and Next. So our project, if we do make a project in this video, if I feel like that we have to, um, we'll make it in this Next and using Pinia. Anyhow, folks, let's try to understand that. The key thing that I want to talk about here is that state management is not equals to state handling. This is something that I've come across so many times, n number of times. I've seen people do this, that they take state management as is, that hey, what are you using for state management? Oh, we're using Redux, we're using Pinia, we're using provider, we're using XYZ thing, we're using block pattern, we're using get it. The list goes on. So many tools, so many libraries, but that is all that these libraries do. They help you with management of the state. They are not exactly enforcing an architecture or a pattern or a structure that you should be following to handle those states. Now I would want you to, if you are coming from a mobile development environment, I would want you to, this is not exactly for you folks, right? This is primarily for the folks who work in the web development environment, or in general any software environment. This can be used anywhere. But why I'm cherry picking the mobile devs, because you folks already, like I said, have your own architecture enforced to you by how however you building your software, MVC, MVP, MVVC, MVVM, XYZ. Anyhow, so we have this. This is the primary thing that I want to talk about. I want to talk about that state management is not equal to state handling. What exactly is the difference between these two? What do I mean when I say that state management is not equal to like, are these two things different? What are these? To understand this, let's take a example. Let's take a very tiny problem statement here. Um, or maybe we could just refer to the article that I have written. If I come back to my article, I'm describing a problem, like, so that let's say that we have an app, we have a product where we are where I have, my screen is probably white out, where I'm being flashbang with white light right now. Anyhow, so let's say that I have a app, a website, or anything that is, and I have the option to search something there, and there's a button, and when I click on that search button, it fetches me sources, fetches me result for whatever I've searched for. So let's say I've searched for chicken wings, and it gets me data from multiple sources. So data from source one, let's say here, it takes 2 seconds, and data from source 2 or from some other source takes 0.7 seconds, and so on. So up to n number of sources, they all take t amount of time, and it's variable for every, like, different sources. It could be same, coincidentally, for two sources to have the same amount of time, and so on and so forth. You get the idea, right? It makes the API calls for chicken, for the keyword chicken wings, and it gets data from source 1, source 2, and they both take their sweet amount of time, however long they want to take. So, right. Now, generally, when we want to handle these states, what I've seen developers do, or what I've seen a lot of folks do, uh, across levels from junior to senior, I'm not blaming anyone. This is not the wrong thing to do. This is okay. This is fine because it works. It's just that a bit more rudimentary, and I'll tell you why I do not prefer doing things like so. So let's say when we click on that enter button, we fire a method called fetch data. And let's just say that this is a UI component, and like so, right? Now, UI component at the moment has got nothing to do with this method. We click on that search button, and the only duty or the only job of this particular UI component is to show data, right? Is to show the response that we're getting. It could be the wrong response, it could be the right response, it could be an error message, it could be anything of any sort. But what we do here is the simplest and the most rudimentary approach that I've seen is that we create a variable, right? They create a variable called a state called is loading, and by default it is false. And the moment we enter the method, what we do is we set that state to true. Now we know that it's true, and what this UI component is going to react to it is how this UI component is going to react to this particular change in the state is, we, based on this is loading state, we show a loading component. It could be a preloader, it could be a circular loader, it could be anything. It could be just a simple text that it is loading. It does not matter. But the thing is that the UI component now depends on this particular state, which is fine, right? We are just updating the loading state, and then by the end of the method, when we are exiting the method, we set it to false. And the moment we set it to false, we, between these two steps, when we set it to true and when we set it to false, we perform something. We fetch the data from source, and we receive the response. Now, so the response can be good and it can be bad, as simple as that. It could be success, it could be failure. We are already handling the loading state. We get the data. Let's say we get the data in a form of array, right? In our JSON response, in an object, inside the object we have an array, and we check that whether the length of the so sorry, length of the response that we have received is like greater than 0, so we have received a proper response, so we set it to success, so we go into the good response part, right? We now it's a good response, so we are aware of that. On the other hand, if it's an empty response, if you haven't received anything, or if it's some sort of error, or maybe a 404 500 something, which corresponds to an error of sorts, we push the bad response thingy. But how do we handle these two states now? So a very rudimentary approach again is to create two more variables, that is data fetch failed false, and is data fetch success two false as well. So if when we are performing this particular performing the actual data fetching, and then we are checking for the data, we update these two states accordingly. Now what happens is, um, the first problem that arises here is it's not a maintainable piece of code. You have written so much garbage, you have maintained these three variables just for the sake of showing a component. I mean, you could shorten it down, you could use your brain, you could bring it down to just using one variable, you could bring it down to using maybe just two, or maybe not even just one variable and a couple of more logic. But the problem here arises is it's not maintainable, right? You are aware what this boolean value is doing, and when you create writing a service, when you, let's say you're creating a page or of any sort, and there are multiple components that you're supposed to handle, and they all correspond to the response of the API differently, and in a different manner. Maybe a button changes color, maybe some component gets disabled when you get a bad response, or maybe when you get a good response, some other component gets disabled, that XYZ thingy, right? Each responds to it in a different fashion. And for each individual relationship that you build between these components and different components of your page, your service, and XYZ, you will end up having a ton or an n number of boolean values, and only you are aware or comfortable, the proper word would be you are familiar with what each boolean value is doing in this regard. And this is not really scalable, because when you give a KT to some other engineer, you will be telling me, oh, you'll be telling them, okay, this variable, this boolean value does this boolean value is updated when this happens, and this corresponds to this. Imagine how tiresome and terrible of a KT it's going to be, because now that engineer, he or she will have to inherit the garbage that you have written, because this is not okay. Not definitely not in a production environment. I will definitely not recommend doing this in production scale. So how do we even handle this? Another will obviously I'll tell you how we're going to handle this, but there's another thing that is bad, which is the separation of concerns. No, see, you can have as descriptive variable or state names as you can have. So is loading or is data fetching failed, is data fetching for source one success, is menu items loading, so on and so forth. uh, but then again, no matter how descriptive you are, these variable names or this methodology in itself is stale, because as the code is going to expand, maybe you leave the company, maybe you move on to some other you start working with some other team, maybe on something other feature altogether. Another engineer has to inherit, and he has to follow the same steps and extend to your garbage, right? So he will be writing more things, more redundant code, more number of similar number of variables. So let's say within your service there are 3 components, and per component you're making 4 to 5 boolean values to handle all of the states in a nice and tidy manner, right? He's going to do and now this another engineer has to add on to your feature, add on to your service. So he follows your footsteps, he follows the architecture that you have followed so far, or that you're following so far, and he also creates a number of variables, a number of boolean states, and then he is also following the same things. And this becomes a problem, because why would he or she want to do the similar thing that you have done? Because if he is dependent on any of the methods that you have written, let's say he wants to use the data from, or he wants to use this particular method, fetch data, for his feature or for his change, he has to do it like you are doing. So he has to depend on these silly boolean values. And the funniest part is that these values are created in, if you have worked with Redux or if you have worked with Pinia, they create these values within these stores so that they can be accessed from anywhere at any point. Is this is not the way of doing things. I mean, okay, yes, it works for smaller features, it works for smaller use cases, but it is not a scalable, maintainable piece of code. This is very, very wrong. And the third reason why it is wrong is we have discussed so far is that it is not maintainable, it is not KT worthy. This is very rudimentary and stupid. And the third reason is that it brings, when it comes to UI component, and you get the data, so the only two changes that the UI component is going to respond to is whether it is loading or not. If it is loading, it's going to show you the loading state or whatever you have. Maybe it could be a preloader, it could be a circular loader, XYZ. But on the other hand, when it is not loading, it's going to show you the data. Now, this data can be or can not be good or bad. So, if the data is good, it's going to render out the data. Let's say it's profile information, or just data for the chicken wings that we just discussed, with along with the images and prices XYZ. It shows you that. But let's say the data came in empty, right? So data came in empty, so now you'll have to handle that logic either in the UI, right? Or maybe you'll have to manage these two additional boolean values and update them accordingly if you want to check this check the data within the method. When you're checking the method, this fetch data name becomes absolutely redundant, so you want to add the name instead to fetch data and validate it and stuff and update state, because now fetch data only means that you're fetching the data. It does not imply to the fact that whenever your data is coming, you are also updating the state, and you're also you're checking the data, the response from whatever XYZ source or API that it is coming from, and you're also updating a state based on the condition of what you have received, the response. And this becomes very difficult when you are writing documentation and maintaining it, because the name says that it is doing something, but in reality it is doing a lot more than just what the name is describing it, describing that this function does. So I could write a method that fetch data or get data from sources, and now I'm doing a number of things. So during documentation, these things can get missed, right? During and even before and after documentation, this can become a very tedious task for any another engineer to follow up or catch on to. How do we address this? How do we handle all of this? And now, because our UI is, of course, again, will be handling the data, it is now tightly coupled to this method, tightly coupled to the response state that we're going to get, which is not what we want to do. Our UI should only pick up the response and render it as is. It should not be checking whether it is successful, whether it has failed or not, and it should not be doing anything. It should not have anything to do with the business logic, because your UI should depend on your business logic, but your business logic should not depend on, or should not change, because you're handling it in your user interface. Yes, now do not get confused when I say this, that okay, user interactions are going to happen and they're going to change. User interactions are gonna trigger another business logic, right? A part of your business, that is part of your business logic only. They're gonna trigger that in a different fashion. But your UI component composable, or the HTML that you have written, should not be so tightly coupled to the methods that you have written that it is not usable. This is not usable in any regard, right? Because now it is so tightly coupled to this particular data. So unless and until this particular component that you have built is curated and crafted specifically for this particular method and this particular data, then it is fine, you're good to go. You can write as much as garbage as you want to, because now it is not garbage, this is just the architecture and it works. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. But you want to disconnect this, so that if I disconnect this and let's say as a prop, I can pass in the data and it renders it accordingly. now I have a reusable component and I can use it at n number of places within my product, within my site, within my app, PWA, whatever it is. That is what we want to talk about. Another thing, the problem, another set of problem that arises within this particular methodology is when we are rendering the same multiple sources within the same component. And it's going to be let me quickly describe that problem. Let's go back to the article and see, and let's have a deeper dive on what the problem exactly is, right? So here I'm saying is that the internal state, so let us understand the possible states that we should or can handle to make the user experience better. So whenever I'm getting response from the chicken wing sources, there are certain some states that I need to handle. The first one, of course, we talked about is the loading state. So we would like to implement a loader. Whenever the data is loading, we want to let the user know that the data is coming or something is happening, right? So new data is being fetched. And of course, we want to maintain a successful state that once the data has been fetched, we'd like to know that, show that to the user. For the sake of simplicity, we'll assume that the response is something like this from the API. And once we receive a successful response, we want to show that to the user. And then we want to show it a failed state as well. So since we're handling a success state, it's obvious that we need to handle a failed state as well, which is pretty straightforward. And we're making a network request and to an external source, and there can be any number of factors that could affect this particular network request and the response that we receive from this source. So we can have we should have a failed state as well. So now we have a loading state, we have a successful state, and we have a failed state. Perfect. So like we said, we can have an is loading state, and simply we can define it like so. Data from source 1, source 2, source 3. Now let's quickly jump back to the diagram and the problem that we just discussed. See, the problem here is when we talk about boolean, a boolean value, let's say, is loading, right? And we give it a value of false. This particular variable can only have two values. It can either be false or it can either be true. How do you, true, right? It can either be false and it can either be true. And in a fashion, this is only, you can only have two particular states to this. You can only have on and let's say off. So you can only have off and you can only have on, right? So if it's true, then you can have the on state. If it's not true or if it's false, you're going to go to the false state. Just these two states. But we just, and it's like 30 seconds, 50 seconds ago, we figured out that we are handling three different states. We have a loading state that we want to cater to. We want to take care of a success state as well. And finally, we also want to care as a fail state. These are three states. And the boolean as a state is not sufficient enough to handle it. Maybe if we were dealing with a binary condition like a light switch kind of condition, maybe a toggle button, a boolean state is fantastic for us to handle it. But whenever we're dealing with an asynchronous response, asynchronous process, the response is not always true and false, and it's not always success and failed, because there is a middle state that we have just figured out, which is the loading one. When we start the process, there is a loading state, and then it's the success or failed state. Depends on what the response is like. So boolean value is clearly not sufficient enough for us. So, and we have figured out that we are dealing with three states. So if we come back to the article quickly, we are discussing that we have figured out, we have set the grounds that different sources take different time. Now here comes the problem, right? Whenever we're dealing with such a state, let's say when we are going to write the UI for this, we are going to get the response. So we're going to start writing the UI. We're going to put this in a loop, in a kind of for loop or something like that. For let's say if you have worked with Next, so we or Vue.js, we're gonna put this in a v4. Or if you have worked with React, we're gonna put this in a for loop, a very normal for loop that okay, just quickly render out data from all the sources, and we show different cards for different sources. And here comes the problem. the data from source 2 took only 0.7 seconds. So we saw a loader, a circular loader or a preloader for 0.7 seconds, and then we want to show the user the data from this particular source. And while it is taking 2 seconds, or maybe it could take 10 seconds, 15 seconds, does not matter. Why I don't want, I want to show it, I want to keep this particular card in the loading state, but I want to show data for source 2 because it is complete. I do not want to wrap this entire component into a singular is loading state. So here comes the problem. If we have n number of sources and each source takes t amount of time, are we going to create m number of boolean variables, right, to handle each particular source's state? Okay, data from source 1 is dynamically loading, data from source 2 is dynamically loading to false, first one is false, and then we manually set each one of them to true whenever the data fetching is complete. That would become absolutely absurd, and that is the nonsense, absolute most garbage way of writing the code. But if we come back here, and if this is how we were writing the code, we'd have to scale it like so, right? We'll have to scale, if we are writing the code like this, we'll have to scale this to handle a situation like this. And this is a very common situation in majority of the products that are being built today. The products that we built are not simple, that we click 2-3 clicks and you get the response. No, there are a lot of things happening under the hood and a lot of the handling that you have to do. And this is a very simple case or a very simple problem, right? We don't want to scale this like we just discussed. How do we do so, right? So let's try to, you guys can definitely read to the article. So this is why I have been arguing that state management is not state handling, because we are not handling the states. Okay, if we create these particular states in our store, in our Redux store, or in our Pinia store, that is management, because yeah, I have declared them, and then I have defined them. Modifying them wherever I do so within a method or outside the method by accessing that particular state, that is handling. And this is not the correct way of handling these states in a production environment in whatever app you're building, right? So a very simple and a very I would say, this thing came into my mind while I was working at a startup. The startup was called Three Dots. They're not operational anymore, but this is something that came into my mind when we were working on Flutter, and that's where this thing clicked into me. And this current implementation is working in production, and we're serving a lot of folks. I won't tell you where. I've signed an NDA. So yeah, right. So for this, like I said, I will be using TypeScript. So let's quickly see if we can open a TypeScript pad. Type script TypeScript pad up. I'll just try and open Visual Studio Code quickly. Right, I might have a project. Do I have a project? Yeah, I have a project. This is the next project only. We can use this. I'll create let's create here in the composable folder. I don't know if you folks can see this. You guys can ignore all of these files. These are not associated with this video. I'm going to create a new composable, maybe let's just say new file, and let's just say state handler with a hyphen handler.ts. So we now have a proper TypeScript file. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to close my terminal. I'm going to close this and I'm going to put it to the side, and we don't need the TypeScript pad. And I'm going to put this to the side here. So now they're both side by side. Now let's just follow the article itself that I have written. Right. The solution is that I'm going to use TypeScript for this. You guys can use JavaScript or PHP if you want problems in your life, but you'll have to implement it in a different fashion. Anyhow, the first thing that we're going to do here is, let's say we're going to create a type. I'm not going to export it, or should I? Let's just say that I'm going to export it. and we're going to export a type, and the type is let's just call it state, right? And the type is going to be called state, and it can have 4 possible values, or let's just say 3 possible values that we discussed. It can have a success state. This like state can be success, and or it can be failed, right? And there was one other state that we discussed as well, which was loading. Apart from this, let's add another state, which is idle, right? I will come to this why I'm adding the idle state as well. Let me do this, right? So why am I adding the idle state as well? We'll come to this, or maybe you'll understand on your own why we're adding this, right? Apart from that, now let's create an interface like so. I'm following the tutorial itself. I'm just doing so. Let's just, instead of wasting time, let me just quickly copy this here, and I'm going to paste it here. Let's take a deeper dive here. We now understand what we are doing. We have created a type called state, and the state can have four values only. It can either be success, it can either be failed, loading, or idle. Then we have created an interface called API state. You can call it whatever you want to. You can call this whatever you want to, entirely up to you. And this is an object, like not an object, but this interface has the following key value pairs. The first one is the status. So now the API state has the status of type state, this one. I'll tell you how it's going to make sense. And then we have 2 other values which are completely optional, message and data. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to remove these, right? And we're just going to keep it like so. Now what happens is, let's say now let's come back to a problem here. Our approach was that we created an is loading state, and we set it to false, we set it to true based on our method and XYZ thingy. Now we're going to approach the same problem. We're gonna handle the same problem use case that we have here, but we'll use this implementation of internally handling the states, right? So let's try to do this. For instance, let's say we can create a dummy method. So const fetch and handle states, state fetch data and handle state. I'm going to create an arrow function here quickly. So now there's that. So the first thing that I want to do here is what I'm going to do. Let's say the const data, I've created data, and I'm going to create a state for this, data state. So the state of the data that I'm going to be fetching is going to be of the type API state, right? It's going to be of the type API state, right? Or what you can do here is I'm going to do this, right? So now you'll notice that, or maybe you can make it a type here. So if I quickly come up here, and if I add a status object, you'll notice that this is bizarre. This shouldn't be happening. What is happening? API state. This is we're exporting that. Oh, my bad, folks, my bad. Right. I forget that you're supposed to do that. So I've created a data state, right? And it is of the type API state. I completely forgot to add these square arrows. Anyhow, if I come up here, now since that is type safe, if I press Control and spacebar, I can only add a property called status, and the status will only accept these following 4 values. It can either be failed, idle, loading, or success, right? So by default, it's not success, it's not neither loading, and nor is it failed. Hence, we want to put it in idle. So now we have declared the idle state as well. Now the moment now we come back to our method, fetch data and handle state. So let's say the moment we enter this particular method, I want to set the state to loading. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to data state, and I'm going to use the dot operator to enter that state, and I'm going to change the status to loading. Now, since this is type safe, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm not doing anything rudimentary. I'm not doing anything unconventional or of sorts, right? I know exactly what I'm doing. So I have updated the status of my data state, and how is it going to respond into my UI? Let's quickly come up here and Excalidraw. Let's see how it's going to happen, how it's going to turn out. Oh my god. So I have this little box here. Forget this arrow, folks. Let's have another one of you, right? Let's discuss the first one, loading state, right? So what I'm going to do in the UI front, on the UI front, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write within my HTML, let's say within my HTML or within my view file or within my JSX file, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write up at a parent level, it's going to be a div, and the div is going to have an if statement. That div, this particular div is only going to render itself when if data, I'm going to access the state that we have created in whatever state management library or tool XYZ thingy that you're using. So in our case, we're using Pinia, for example, or if you're using Redux, what you'd want to do is you want to access the state from your Redux library, Redux store or Pinia store. So the data state that we created here, for example, data state dot status is equal to loading, right? How the interesting, you might be wondering, how is it going to turn out, how is it going to function in the UI front? So let's it's going to be in a comma, not a curly brace. So what I'm going to do here is I should have a component here, right here, right? So within my UI or within my method here, so you see I'm exporting both of those methods. I should also export you as well, right? I'm gonna export the state as well. I'm not using an actual store right now. I've just created a simple TypeScript file, and if I start typing here data state, it's gonna import data state from there. And I'm currently working in a different it's a personal project of mine. I'll talk about this as well, but that's a video for some other day. Let's write another method, const test temp. Let's just call it temp for this file. And let's say now data state that we're trying to access dot status is equal to let's say, yeah. So we're trying to do this, right? Exactly. That if data state dot status is equal to, let's say, loading, we wanna do something, do some loading, right? We want to do some loading, we want to do this. But how is it going to translate within a UI? So I'm just gonna come up here, forget the UI that I've written so far, right? We'll have a div, right? And that div is going to have an if statement attached to it, and with that if statement is going to be, triggered, or it's going to be functional based on the data state dot status. If its value, now again, since it's type safe and we have ensured that it can either be of failed, idle, loading, and success, we can handle so for the loading state, we're going to show, let's say loading, we're just going to show a copy that it's loading dot, something like so. And all you have to do to replicate this is essentially alt, yeah, sorry, we're gonna do this quickly. So now we have handled the loading state. Now we can simply handle the success state as well, and of course we can handle the failed state as well, and like so we can handle the idle state. I can do this, And let's say when it's failed, I want to show failed, you are bad, something like that, doesn't matter. Success, you are awesome, something just like that, right? So whenever in our method, let's say fetch data and handling, I push it to state loading and I do something, I get my data, and then I check my data, sorry, check my response data, right? And based on that, what I can do here is I can again update the state of my data like so to something new. So let's say my data was correct, so I can push it to success. So if, let's say, true, right, I want to do a success state, else it's never going to go in this particular condition, right? It's never actually going to go into this particular condition of else statement, but we're just going to write down, and for the sake of understanding, failed. This is great because this is unreachable code. It's always going to be true and it's always going to come up here, but let's say this condition true depends on our data, our response that we, I'm so sorry, the response that we get from the API, right? So like so, and by default we can make it idle, right? And maybe based on the conditions as well, we can push idle, and we can use idle however we want to. We can use success however we want to. We maybe, if in success we want to show a failed response, we can do that. If in failed response we can show a successful response, we can do that, because now on the UI front, here, right, it's only going to render any one of these divs, right, based on this condition. So if it's loading, it's going to render this. If the status is success, it's going to render this. And if it's failed, if the value of data.state is failed, it's going to render this. And if it's idle, it's going to do that, it's going to render this. So this, what is it going to do? First of all, this is going to declutter your UI. Within the UI file, within your UI, you know exactly what you're dealing with. So in, let's say there is a bug, and you see that failed response is being pushed. You see in the UI that failed, something has failed, because now you'll know when you see the UI that you are exactly here. This is happening. This UI is being rendered. This UI is being rendered to the user, and all you have to do is go to your code, go to your business logic part, and now you have to check when exactly are you pushing, at what places are you pushing the failed state. And now you want to check, okay, this is the place where I'm pushing the failed state. This is unreachable code. This is not happening. This is never reaching here. This is a bug, so I can fix this. This helps you debug. This declutters your UI, and this directs you to exactly where you want to go. Because see, at the end of the day, your code is stupid and your computer is dumb, and they're doing exactly what you want them to do. You want the computer to do something, that is exactly what it is doing. Your code is doing exactly what you have written it to do, right? So this particular approach directs you towards where or what you have done. So when it is failed, you know that, okay, if this particular this UI is being rendered, something is wrong in my code within, whenever I'm pushing the fail state. So I can go back to my code and I can check, oh, okay, this is where I'm pushing the fail state, this is where I'm pushing the fail state, and something is wrong here and there, here and there, right? And so on and so forth. We can remove this. What is wrong with you? Sorry. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that, folks. Anyhow, so now we know where my UI is failing. Now this is decluttering my UI. This is helping me debug my code in a much faster and an elegant fashion. Another thing is, this is maintainable and this is scalable. I can create another state as such for any other process, and I can call it some data source 2 state. This has nothing to do with val, by the way. And this could be data source one, and I can create n number of sources, or maybe I can make it entirely dynamic, and I could update it dynamically, and now I don't have to deal with those boolean values that are limited to just two states, which is on and off, true and false, 0 and 1. Right. Apart from this, I removed certain values. I can have a message and string as well here if I want to. That if I like, if defined so. And if I come up here, I can also have a data and message associated within the state. So now what happens is, let's say I do get my response, I can directly push that response within my state object here in the data, in the data object of my state that I have created. So if I create a state here, data, let's say by default it's just an empty array or maybe an empty object, right? And what I'm going to do here is, let's say I do get my response, I check my response data and it is success. So what I do here is data state dot, first of all, the thing that I want to do here is I want to set it to success because my data is okay, I'm assuming. And the next thing that I want to do here is I want to update the data. So let's say data is going to be equivalent to whatever my response is from the array, right? Wait, hold on. Response is from the, not from the array, from the API or from any external source that I'm using. And I can update this dynamically as well, because now this data state, I can pass in whatever state I want to. I can take it as an argument here if I want to, or I can simply, create an array of these states and I can systematically update them based on the data, based on the response that I'm getting. And if they are being, if I'm receiving data from different sources, like in our original problem statement here of the chicken wings, that one one was, there's source one that is giving data in 2 seconds, and there's one that is giving data to us in 0.7 seconds. So simply what I can do here is I can create a method that fetches data from source one, another method that fetches from data from source two, and they both individually handle the states for those particular cards. So it can take any amount of time, it'll be handled by this method, or the other the source one can take an amount of time, t amounts of time, does not matter. It can take 30 hours if it has to, does not matter, because this particular method is going to handle that. On the other hand, we'll have the one source that is giving data to us in 0.7 seconds will be handled by a completely different method. So in that fashion, we have separated the concerns, we have separated the states itself. And this is not a lot of engineering that we're doing here. This is a very simple way of structuring the code and bringing in architecture and essentially a system to how we are handling the states and how we are managing our UI, decoupling the UI from our business logic, and we're keeping them both separate. So the UI should be elegant and it should be clean, and it should only be concerned with rendering the UI conditionally, unconditionally, and dynamically based on the business logic. The business logic should not depend on what the current state of UI is, or the UI should not be altering or making changes, or you know do any sort of computation in a sense, in a fashion that your business logic is not doing. So your business logic is simply getting your data from some source, and then you compute and check things, compute and check things on your UI, as to what you want to show. Because then your business logic is not really a business logic, it's just it's serving as a repo or a repository file that is all what it is doing is fetching data from the internet and updating a loading variable. We also figured out that this is not exactly a scalable way of handling things. So if you do so, it's okay if you're dealing with small rudimentary things, but I would still recommend that you switch to something like this if you are working in a type safe environment. And this is the primary reason why I said that this is language agnostic, right? You can do this in Java, you can do this in C++, you can do this in Go, you can do this in Dart, TypeScript. In JavaScript or PHP, you'll have to create an I you'll have to create an object, not a type, not an interface. You'll just have to create an object, or maybe something of that sort. again, you can do this, but not recommended. Not really not recommended, but it's just that I haven't really explored doing this in PHP or in a non-type safe environment. So that is for you to explore, and let me know what your experience is if you do try it out in JS or PHP or any other language as bizarre as them. Right. The rest of the article discovers this, covers the same things that we have discussed so far, that I have discussed so far, and it goes a little bit in more depth within onto the code part, right? It goes a little bit in more depth as to how we want to do this. One interesting thing that I didn't cover is a method that you can create, a simple composable or a reusable method, a utility method called, I'm calling it a use state modifier. You're free to call it whatever you want, of course. So it takes an argument, an API state, right? And it also takes an argument of new state, new data, new message, where both the last two variables are optional. So what happens inside this method is you can simply pass in the state name and the new state that you want to update it to, and it's just going to change that. It's what we are doing here, you know, this method is going to do this for us. So if we have a new message, it's going to update that, and if we have a new data, it's going to update it to that, right? In action, it would look something like this: that we have created get food details from different sources, and this is the method, and it takes state name and endpoint. So when we go into the try block, if we, the use state modifier method is called, and it pushes the state name that we have received as an functional argument or as a parameter here, and we also push the loading state and with the message loading, and then we push the data, then we push the response into state name dot data. We fetch it like so, right? This is all very basic and very straightforward. And if state name dot data, if we have received any response, we can update it to success state. Otherwise, we can throw an error, and within a catch block we can push the failed state. So this is how you would want to handle your business logic, and your UI will be clutter free, and it'll be just this, and it'll be taking care of itself on its own. I'm just going to quickly undo all of this because this is a completely different project and I don't want it here, right? And as for this file is concerned, I'm just going to remove this line for this file. Anyhow, folks, yeah, here's the UI, how it would look like, right? And I'd leave the link to this particular blog article, whatever you want to call it, in the description. So feel free to feel free to read it, feel free to replicate it, feel free to elaborate and expand onto this particular methodology. And if you have your 2 cents, 4 cents, anything, please do drop them in the comments. Please do let me know what you think about it. And yes, thank you so much. It has been fun discussing this. I've been wanting to do this from a long while. I am a little tired now as well. So we'll catch you guys in some other video, maybe, right? I just close my screen sharing? Hold on. Yes, I did. So I don't know. Anyhow, folks, bye.